The Caledonia Mills Fire Spook Incident. Winter in Nova Scotia is historically unforgiving, but the early months of 1922 brought a specific kind of isolation to the rural communities of Antigonish County. The landscape was buried under deep snowdrifts, effectively cutting off remote properties from the outside world. In the farming community of Caledonia Mills, the days were short and the nights were long, cold, and entirely silent. It was an environment that demanded resilience, where families relied heavily on routine and grueling manual labor just to keep their households running and their livestock alive. Alexander MacDonald and his wife Janet had lived this difficult reality for decades. Their farm was situated on a lonely stretch of land, far enough from the main roads that visitors were a rare occurrence even in the summer months. By all available accounts, they were a quiet, deeply traditional couple who kept to themselves and focused entirely on the demands of their property. Living with them was their teenage adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who assisted with the daily chores and provided the aging couple with much-needed help around the farmhouse and the barns. There was absolutely nothing in their background to suggest they were prone to seeking attention or fabricating bizarre stories. The anomalies began in the bitter cold of January, manifesting first in the heavy timber barn where Alexander kept his livestock. The initial incidents were easily dismissed as simple confusion or memory lapses, common enough for an aging farmer dealing with the exhaustion of winter chores. Alexander would enter the barn in the early morning to find that pitchforks, shovels, and buckets had been moved from their usual places and deposited in strange, impractical locations. Sometimes a heavy iron tool would be found balanced precariously on a high rafter, while at other times, essential harnesses were found buried under piles of fresh hay. Alexander initially assumed he had simply forgotten where he left his tools the previous evening, or that Mary Ellen had moved them while she was distracted. But the disturbances soon escalated beyond misplaced tools, taking on a distinctly unsettling character that defied easy logical explanation. Alexander began finding his cattle unclipped from their heavy winter stalls, wandering aimlessly within the confined space of the barn. On several mornings, he discovered the massive animals completely relocated, securely tied into different stalls with complex knots that he didn't recognize and certainly hadn't tied himself. The most disturbing of these early barn incidents involved the physical manipulation of the animals themselves, something that deeply rattled the experienced farmer. Alexander walked into the barn one morning to find that the tails of several cows had been intricately braided during the night. The braids were tight, complex, and woven with a level of deliberate care that suggested someone had stood in the freezing darkness for a considerable amount of time performing the bizarre task. For an isolated farming family, the idea of an intruder trespassing in the dead of night just to braid animal hair was intensely frightening. Alexander and Janet began to secure the barn doors with heavier locks, double-checking every latch before retiring to the house for the night. Yet, the disturbances continued unimpeded. The locked doors were found undisturbed in the mornings, but inside, the heavy draft horses would be tied facing the wrong direction, or the feed troughs would be inexplicably emptied and scattered across the dirt floor. The MacDonalds were forced to confront the impossible reality that whatever was happening inside their locked barn was either the work of a phantom intruder who could bypass iron padlocks, or something far less tangible. As February approached, the unsettling activity shifted from the cold expanse of the barn directly into the intimate, enclosed space of the farmhouse. The transition began subtly, with the family hearing heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing across the wooden floors of the empty upstairs bedrooms while they sat around the kitchen stove. Janet reported hearing the distinct sound of furniture being dragged across the floorboards directly above her head, but upon rushing upstairs, she would find every bed, chair, and dresser exactly where it belonged. The ambient tension in the house grew suffocating, compounded by the severe winter weather that kept the family trapped indoors with whatever unseen presence had invaded their home. Then, the true nightmare began, changing the nature of the events from bizarre pranks to an immediate, life-threatening crisis. It started with a sudden, unexplained fire breaking out in a corner of the kitchen, far away from the cast iron stove or any oil lamps. Alexander managed to stomp out the flames before they could spread to the wooden walls, assuming at first that a stray ember had somehow drifted across the room. But this rationalization evaporated just hours later when a second fire spontaneously ignited in a different room entirely. Over the next several days, the McDonald farm became the site of an impossible and relentless siege of spontaneous combustion. Fires began breaking out with terrifying frequency, often in places where ignition wasn't just unlikely, but logically impossible. Wallpapers suddenly blistered and burst into flames with no heat source nearby. Small piles of clothing left on a bed would suddenly begin to smolder, filling the small rooms with thick, acrid smoke. The family was thrown into a state of sheer panic and severe sleep deprivation, forced to keep a continuous, 24-hour watch over every corner of their home. They filled every available bucket and basin with snow and water, placing them strategically throughout the hallways and bedrooms so they could respond instantly the moment they smelled smoke. The psychological toll of this endless vigilance was devastating. Alexander, Janet, and Mary Ellen were practically living in a state of suspended terror, jumping at every creak of the floorboards and sniffing the air constantly. The sheer volume of fires defied any attempt to dismiss them as accidental. In a single day, the family reportedly extinguished over 30 separate, spontaneous fires that erupted on walls, in closets, and under heavy furniture. The phenomenon defied basic physics, specifically in how the fires interacted with wet materials. In a desperate attempt to protect their belongings, the McDonalds had taken to dampening down certain fabrics and hanging wet towels near the walls that seemed most prone to catching fire. However, multiple witnesses, including neighbors who had been called in to help, reported watching with their own eyes as completely soaked towels began to smoke and actively burn. The sight of a dripping wet cloth spontaneously igniting and producing open flames sent shockwaves of genuine horror through the rural community. The local men who had braved the snowstorms to assist the McDonalds found themselves paralyzed by fear, unable to comprehend what they were fighting. They were experienced farmers and woodsmen who understood fire as a tool and a hazard, but the flames in the McDonald house behaved like a living, malicious entity. The fires seemed to intentionally target areas when no one was looking directly at them, bursting into life the moment an observer turned their back or left the room. This predatory behavior of the phenomenon convinced many of the locals that they were dealing with something strictly demonic or cursed. As word of the spontaneous fires spread through the deeply religious and superstitious region of Antigonish County, the farm became a focal point of dark rumors and profound dread. The concept of a fire spook took hold in the local imagination, drawing on old-world folklore that many of the Scottish descendants in the area still quietly respected. Neighbors who had initially offered physical help began to distance themselves, terrified that whatever malicious force had attached itself to the McDonalds might somehow spread to their own timber homes. Those who did stay to help witnessed things that challenged their sanity. Local farmers reported standing in the McDonald kitchen, only to watch a dry mop catch fire in the corner of their vision, or see scorch marks rapidly appear and travel across the ceiling boards like an invisible blowtorch. The smell of the house was entirely altered, permanently reeking of charred wood, burnt cloth, and a strange, sulfurous odor that lingered in the stagnant winter air. Alexander and Janet, exhausted to the point of collapse, finally realized they couldn't survive in the house much longer. The structural integrity of the home was compromised by dozens of small burns, and the mental strain had pushed the elderly couple to their absolute breaking point. In a desperate bid for safety, the McDonald family made the difficult decision to abandon their farm and seek refuge with relatives who lived several miles away. They packed only their most essential belongings, terrified that bringing too much from the infected house might somehow carry the curse with them. The journey through the freezing snow was miserable, but it was driven by the hope that leaving the physical location would mean leaving the terror behind. However, their relief was incredibly short-lived. Almost immediately upon arriving at their relative's home, the impossible anomalies began to manifest in the new location. Strange knocking sounds echoed from the walls of the guest bedroom, and objects began to mysteriously shift when unobserved. The terrifying climax of this displacement occurred when a fresh, spontaneous fire broke out in the relative's house, igniting a piece of furniture in a room where Mary Ellen had been sitting just moments before. The realization that the phenomenon wasn't tied to the geographic location of the farm, but was actually attached to the family themselves, was a devastating psychological blow. They were essentially quarantined by fear, unable to stay in their own home and entirely unsafe in the homes of others. The sheer impossibility of the situation eventually drew the attention of the regional authorities and the broader Canadian media. The Halifax Herald, a major newspaper, caught wind of the bizarre rumors filtering out of Caledonia Mills and dispatched an experienced reporter named Percy Black to investigate the claims of a fire spook. Black was known as a grounded, skeptical journalist who fully expected to arrive in the rural county and quickly uncover a hoax, a series of unfortunate accidents, or a crude scheme for attention. However, upon arriving in the area and interviewing the terrified locals, his skepticism began to fracture. Black visited the abandoned McDonald farm, walking through the freezing, empty house and documenting the extensive burn marks that scarred the walls, floors, and ceilings. He noted that the burns were scattered in ways that defied logical arson. They were high up on walls, in enclosed spaces, and often localized to tiny patches without spreading to obvious nearby kindling. Black interviewed dozens of exhausted witnesses who swore under intense questioning that they had seen fires start from thin air. The resulting articles published in the newspaper transformed the private nightmare of the McDonald family into a national curiosity, drawing letters, theories, and unwanted attention from across the country. The media exposure prompted official law enforcement to take a closer look, though the Royal Canadian Mounted Police found themselves entirely out of their depth. Detectives who were trained to track boot prints, find motives, and interrogate suspects were faced with a situation where the supposed culprit was completely invisible and left no physical evidence other than scorch marks. The police kept a close watch on the family and the surrounding community, looking for any signs of an arsonist or a disgruntled neighbor using chemicals to start the fires. They found absolutely nothing. There weren't any footprints in the snow outside the house during the times the fires started, and no unusual accelerants were found in the ashes. The utter lack of a criminal explanation only fueled the panic. If no human was responsible, the community reasoned, then the cause had to be supernatural. Talk of witchcraft, ancient curses, and demonic possession became the primary topics of conversation in local gathering places. The family, particularly young Mary Ellen, found themselves at the center of intense, whispered scrutiny. Some locals began to look at the teenage girl with deep suspicion, noticing that the fires often seemed to occur in her general vicinity or shortly after she had left a room. The growing national fascination with the Caledonia Mills case eventually reached the desk of Dr. Walter Franklin Prince, a highly respected and rigorous investigator for the American Society for Psychical Research. Prince wasn't a ghost hunter in the sensationalized sense, but rather a methodical, clinical researcher who had built a career on debunking fraudulent mediums and explaining bizarre phenomena through psychology and environmental factors. Intrigued by the detailed reports of spontaneous fires and moving objects, Prince decided to travel to Nova Scotia to conduct a formal, scientific investigation of the McDonald family. His arrival brought a stark change in the atmosphere surrounding the case. Where the locals brought fear and religious dread, Prince brought notebooks, strict observation protocols, and an unflinching demand for empirical evidence. He moved in with the family, essentially turning their daily life into a controlled psychological experiment. Prince immediately recognized the severe stress the family was under, noting their sleep deprivation, their frayed nerves, and their absolute genuine terror of the phenomena. He didn't believe they were intentionally lying, but he was determined to find the rational, earthly mechanism behind the supposed fire spook. Prince focused his investigative lens almost entirely on 16-year-old Mary Ellen, recognizing a pattern that was familiar to him from previous cases of alleged poltergeist activity. Historically, intense kinetic anomalies and unexplained fires often centered around adolescents, particularly young women going through severe emotional or physical transitions. Prince began to shadow Mary Ellen continuously, observing her movements, her emotional state, and her reactions to the stressful environment. He enacted incredibly strict observation rules, ensuring that the teenager was never out of his direct line of sight. He positioned himself in the house so that he could monitor her every action, taking detailed notes on her behavior. Almost immediately after Prince instituted this regime of constant, unbroken observation, the spontaneous fires completely ceased. The sudden cessation of the blazes when under strict scrutiny was the exact empirical evidence Prince was looking for. It strongly suggested to him that the fires required unobserved moments to ignite, which pointed away from supernatural forces and toward a human agent operating, perhaps unknowingly, when no one was looking. However, the cessation of the fires didn't mean the end of the bizarre phenomena, and the haunting merely shifted its presentation in a way that disturbed even the clinical Dr. Prince. With the avenue of fire seemingly blocked by the investigator's constant gaze, the kinetic energy in the house appeared to turn inward, focusing violently on Mary Ellen herself. While sitting perfectly still under Prince's observation, Mary Ellen began to manifest physical anomalies that defied easy explanation. Strange, deep blue marks would suddenly bloom across her arms and face, resembling severe bruises or the aftermath of hard slaps. These marks would appear rapidly, often within seconds, while Prince was looking directly at her, making it impossible for her to have inflicted them upon herself through normal physical means. Mary Ellen complained of sudden, sharp pains and an intense feeling of exhaustion just before the marks appeared. The investigator documented these physical manifestations extensively, noting that the skin wasn't broken, but the bruising was profound and highly localized. This internal escalation presented a fascinating challenge to the investigation, forcing Prince to look deeper into the complex relationship between the human mind and physical trauma. Prince ultimately formulated a comprehensive, though highly controversial, psychological theory to explain the entire Caledonia Mills incident. He concluded that the farm was never visited by a ghost, a demon, or a supernatural fire spook. Instead, he diagnosed Mary Ellen with a severe form of dissociation, theorizing that the intense isolation, the harsh winter environment, and the repressed emotional landscape of the rural household had fractured the teenager's psyche. According to his official report, Mary Ellen was entering fugue states, temporary periods of altered consciousness where she would unknowingly perform complex actions, including starting the fires and moving the heavy objects in the barn. Prince argued that she possessed a secondary, subconscious personality that acted out the repressed anxieties and frustrations of her isolated life. Because she had absolutely no conscious memory of these actions, her terror and confusion were entirely genuine, which is why she passed every local interrogation. Furthermore, Prince explained the spontaneous bruising as a psychosomatic manifestation, an incredibly rare but documented phenomenon where the body produces physical symptoms of trauma in response to severe, internal psychological stress. The presentation of Prince's clinical findings was met with intense resistance and profound dissatisfaction from the local community in Antigonish County. For the farmers and neighbors who had witnessed wet towels bursting into flames and heavy draft horses inexplicably relocated in locked barns, a psychological diagnosis felt vastly inadequate, if not entirely insulting. They argued that a teenage girl, whether in a fugue state or not, couldn't logically bypass heavy iron padlocks in the dead of winter, nor could she cause fires to ignite in areas she couldn't physically reach. The locals maintained that Prince, as an outsider from a distant city, simply couldn't comprehend the dark, ancient forces that occasionally rose up in the isolated regions of the north. They viewed his psychological jargon as a convenient excuse to avoid admitting the existence of the supernatural. The divide between the clinical, academic explanation and the visceral, terrifying lived experience of the locals remained permanent. No consensus was ever reached, leaving the community entirely fractured in its understanding of what had actually preyed upon the MacDonald family during that brutal winter. Despite the cessation of the fires under Prince's watch, the damage to the MacDonald family was total and irreversible. The psychological trauma of the endless nights of terror, combined with the intense, unwanted public scrutiny, had completely destroyed their ability to live a normal life in Caledonia Mills. The aging Alexander and Janet never returned to their beloved farm. The property was entirely abandoned, left to rot in the harsh Nova Scotia elements. The house, scarred by dozens of burn marks and saturated with dark memories, stood empty for years, serving as a grim local monument to the fire spook incident. People would occasionally visit the edge of the property, pointing out the dark windows, but very few dared to actually step inside. The family permanently relocated, seeking anonymity and peace away from the whispers and the pointing fingers. Mary Ellen was eventually removed from the intense spotlight, and her later life was kept fiercely private, shielded from researchers and reporters who sought follow-up interviews. The goal of the family was to entirely erase themselves from the narrative, to disappear into a quiet existence where the shadows didn't spontaneously burst into flames. Decades later, the physical remnants of the haunting were ultimately erased from the landscape, providing a strangely fitting, destructive end to the saga. The abandoned MacDonald farmhouse, which had survived the impossible internal fires of 1922, eventually burned completely to the ground in a massive, uncontrolled blaze. The exact cause of this final fire wasn't ever definitively determined. Some locals believed it was a stray lightning strike, while others suspected transient travelers looking for shelter in the woods. However, a quiet segment of the community always believed that the mysterious energy that had infected the property simply finished the job it had started years earlier. With the house gone, all physical evidence of the scorch marks and the impossible burns was turned to ash, leaving only the archived newspaper clippings, Dr. Prince's detailed psychological reports, and the enduring local folklore. The true nature of the events remains trapped in a historical gray area, caught securely between the rational boundaries of extreme human psychology and the deeply unsettling possibility of the unknown. Today, the incident stands as one of the most thoroughly documented yet profoundly ambiguous cases of kinetic anomalies in North American history. It forces anyone examining the records to confront difficult questions regarding the limits of human perception and the immense, largely uncharted power of the subconscious mind. If Dr. Prince was entirely correct, the case demonstrates that the human brain, under extreme distress, is capable of driving the body to perform incredible, destructive acts entirely outside of conscious awareness, while simultaneously producing severe physical trauma on the skin. This psychological reality is, in many ways, just as disturbing as the concept of a haunting. It suggests that the monsters we fear in the dark may actually be locked within our own minds, waiting for the right combination of isolation and pressure to escape. On the other hand, if the skeptical locals were right, and the phenomena defied all earthly physics, then the case represents a terrifying breach in the natural order. It leaves open the possibility that certain environments, or certain people, can become temporary conduits for forces that operate completely outside of human understanding and scientific measurement. To truly comprehend the terror of the MacDonald family, one must understand the absolute silence and extreme isolation of an early 20th century Canadian winter. Before the advent of modern snow removal and reliable telecommunications, a heavy blizzard could effectively cut a rural farmhouse off from the rest of humanity for weeks at a time. The world shrank to the perimeter of the property line, bounded by towering white drifts and a freezing wind that howled through the timber frames. In this claustrophobic setting, the farmhouse was meant to be the ultimate sanctuary, the only safe haven against a hostile natural environment. When that sanctuary was suddenly violated by an unseen, destructive force, the psychological foundation of the family was completely shattered. There wasn't anywhere to run. Fleeing into the freezing night meant risking death by exposure, while staying inside meant waiting for the walls to spontaneously burst into flames. The family was trapped in an agonizing state of limbo, forced to cohabitate with their own localized nightmare while the rest of the world remained entirely oblivious, separated by miles of impassable, frozen roads. The archived testimonies from the neighbors who eventually pushed their way through the snow to help provide some of the most chilling details of the entire ordeal. These weren't men prone to exaggeration or panic. They were pragmatic, hardened laborers who dealt with injury, harsh weather, and the brutal realities of farm life on a daily basis. Yet, their recorded statements are filled with an unmistakable sense of deep, existential dread. One neighbor reported watching a heavy wooden chair vibrate violently before sliding across the room of its own accord, an event that caused him to instantly drop the buckets of water he was carrying and back out of the house. Another detailed the specific, unnatural behavior of the smoke. Instead of rising naturally to the ceiling and dissipating, he claimed the smoke from the spontaneous fires seemed to cling heavily to the floor, rolling through the hallways like a dense, foul-smelling liquid before suddenly vanishing without a trace. These specific, bizarre details recur throughout the historical record, lending a terrifying consistency to the witnesses' experiences. They all describe an environment that felt fundamentally broken, where gravity, combustion, and logic were temporarily suspended by an invisible, malicious will. Ultimately, the narrative of Caledonia Mills is a testament to the fragility of our perceived reality. The historical records sit quietly in provincial archives, a collection of yellowing newspaper clippings, frantic diary entries, and clinical psychiatric evaluations. They document a brief, terrifying window of time where the impossible undeniably happened, witnessed by dozens of people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward. Whether the cause was a tragic, extreme manifestation of a fractured teenage mind desperately crying out in the dark, or an ancient, localized energy that briefly awakened in the bitter cold, the end result was exactly the same. A family was broken, a home was destroyed, and a community was permanently scarred by fear. The true horror of the case doesn't lie in the jump scares or the dramatic flames, but in the lingering, quiet realization that under the right conditions of isolation and stress, the rules of the physical world can completely fall apart. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying phenomena aren't the ones that hide in the shadows, but the ones that step directly into the light, burst into flames, and refuse to be explained away.